Welcome to episode 2.1 of How to Argue Like a Decent Human Being. In this series, you will learn how to present and evaluate arguments, and also learn some key concepts from logic. In episode 1, you learned the technical and ordinary definitions of the term argument. In episodes starting with the number 2, I will explain what makes an argument good or bad. In this episode, you will learn a few specific criteria for evaluating the goodness of an argument. As with episode 1, there will be exercises at the end of the video. Before we begin, I have one disclaimer. I am not even going to attempt to provide a complete definition of goodness in this series, because doing so would require more than a library's worth of texts. However, one way to gauge the goodness of something is to assess whether and to what extent it does what it's supposed to do. For instance, the goodness of a knife can be measured in terms of how easily it can cut various items. Similarly, one way to determine the goodness of an argument is to see whether and to what extent it does what it's meant to do. So what's an argument meant to do? In episode 1, some of you commented, correctly, that we present an argument in order to convince or persuade someone. Therefore, the goodness of an argument can be evaluated based on how successfully it convinces others of your point. With these points in mind, you will see how to evaluate the goodness of an argument based on a number of criteria. Scoring high on these criteria means that your argument is more convincing. The first pair of criteria are validity, soundness, and strength, cogency. The validity of an argument concerns the form and structure of the argument. An argument typically consists of at least one premise and a conclusion. An argument is said to be valid if and only if its conclusion follows from or is entailed by the premises. In other words, in a valid argument, if all the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. On the other hand, an invalid argument is an argument where, even when all the premises are true, the conclusion can still be false. When all the premises of a valid argument are true, then the argument is said to be sound. On the other hand, if at least one of the premises of a valid argument is false, then the argument is unsound. On the criterion of validity, soundness, we should aim for sound arguments. Let's see some examples of both valid and invalid arguments. 1. All humans are mammals. X is a human. Therefore, X is a mammal. In this argument, the first two statements are the premises, and the third one is the conclusion. The first premise can be converted into the following conditional statement. For every Y, if Y is a human, then Y is a mammal. The second premise states that an entity called X exists, and that X is a human. Since there are no humans that are not mammals, if both these premises are true, then the conclusion also must be true. Therefore, this argument is valid. However, since X is merely a placeholder and its referent is unknown, the truth of the second premise is indeterminate. For example, if X refers to a pug, then the second premise is false. On the other hand, if X refers to a real human, for example, me, then the second premise is true, which makes argument 1 sound. 2. If an animal has wings, it can fly. This ostrich has wings. Therefore, the ostrich can fly. This argument has the form if P, then Q, P. Therefore, Q. This form is known to be valid. However, the first premise and the conclusion are obviously false. Just because an animal has wings, it doesn't mean that it can fly, and ostriches are a well-known example of flightless birds. Therefore, this argument is valid but unsound. 3. I see a red car. I see another red car. Therefore, all cars are red. The first two statements are statements of observation that report the existence of two red cars. However, just because you see two red cars doesn't mean that all cars in existence are red. In fact, the next car you see may well be a non-red car. Therefore, this argument is invalid. Invalid arguments cannot be sound. 4. I have a 99.9% chance of winning the game. Therefore, I will win the game. The premise estimates a very high probability, but there is still a 0.1% chance of you losing. So, there is no guarantee that you will win. Therefore, the argument is invalid and unsound. 5. The current king of France is rich. The current king of America is also rich. Therefore, Jeff Bezos is rich. The two premises of this argument are obviously false, since neither France nor the US is a monarchy. However, even if they were true, they have nothing to do with the wealth of Jeff Bezos. That is, the conclusion doesn't follow from the premises. Therefore, this argument is also invalid and unsound. Why is validity so important? After all, an argument can be invalid, yet its conclusion can still be true. For instance, argument 4 was invalid, but the conclusion will probably turn out to be true because of the high probability. It would be highly irrational of you to bet on this person losing just because the argument is invalid. Likewise, argument 5 was also invalid, but its conclusion is clearly true, as Jeff Bezos is currently the richest person in the world. The answer to the question of why validity is so crucial, then, is because validity has the potential to guarantee the truth of the conclusion. If you can establish the validity of your argument and demonstrate that the premises are all true, then whoever you are talking to must accept your conclusion, assuming that you are conversing with a logical being. There can be nothing more convincing than an irrefutable argument. This is why many ancient Greek philosophers devoted so much of their time to the study of deductive reasoning, a form of reasoning that utilizes the truth-preserving property of valid arguments, especially syllogisms, exemplified by argument 1. Mathematicians also rely on deductive reasoning. A mathematical theorem, once proven deductively, will remain true forever, so you have no choice but to accept this truth. Does this mean that all arguments must be valid and sound in order to be good? No, that's not what I'm saying. While validity and soundness are desirable and should be pursued if attainable, it's not always possible to form a valid or sound argument. Though there is no guarantee that the conclusion of an invalid argument will be true, you can still make the invalid argument convincing by showing that your premises and conclusion are probably true. Your conclusion may turn out to be incorrect, but sometimes that's all you can do. This is what inductive arguments try to accomplish. In contrast to a deductive argument, an inductive argument cannot guarantee the truth of the conclusion. Instead, it attempts to show the conclusion is probable by presenting as much evidence as possible. An inductive argument is said to be strong if the conclusion is probably true, assuming that all the premises are true, and weak if the conclusion is probably false, even if we assume that all the premises are true. An inductive argument is said to be cogent if it is strong and also if the premises are all true, and uncogent otherwise. Therefore, on the criterion of strength, cogency, we should aim for cogent arguments. Let's look at some examples of inductive arguments. 6. Car 1 is red. Car 2 is red. Therefore, all cars are red. This is a restated version of argument 3. The two premises present observational evidence in support of the conclusion, and the conclusion makes a generalization about all cars based on a finite number of observations. This form of inductive reasoning is called enumerative induction because you enumerate or list individual observations. An enumerative argument generally gets stronger as the number of observations increases. For example, if the number of observations reaches, say, 1 billion, then you might be more willing to concede that the conclusion is probable. However, even then, I doubt you'll be inclined to accept this argument, because your real-life experience tells you that there exist non-red cars. In general, inductive generalizations are difficult to maintain, because a single piece of counter-evidence is sufficient to refute it. 7. Car 1 is red. Car 2 is red. Therefore, car 3 will be red. This is a modified version of argument 6. In contrast to argument 6, this argument makes a prediction about the future observation. It is another enumerative inductive argument. This argument currently presents only 2 observations, and I expect you to concur that it's very weak and therefore uncogent. However, like we did with the previous example, if we increase the number of observations to 1 billion, perhaps you will be more willing to accept the conclusion. After all, you could be in a mega factory that manufactures only red cars. In this case, this argument can be considered strong and cogent, but it's still invalid because there is always the possibility that the next car might be non-red, no matter how improbable. 8. The sun rose yesterday. The sun rose today. Therefore, the sun will rise tomorrow. Most of us live our lives under the assumption that this argument holds true. However, as with every inductive argument, the conclusion is not guaranteed. The strength of this argument depends on a number of factors, including but not limited to the state of the Sun, the state of the Earth, and the relation between the two. As of September 2020, both celestial objects seem to be stable, and the distance between them is sufficiently great, so our acceptance of this argument is justified, given all we know. Therefore, this argument can be deemed strong now. However, back when neither the Sun nor our planet existed, this argument would have made no sense. Similarly, when the demise of either one of them is imminent, the argument would be false, and therefore uncogent. 9. 8 out of 10 men interviewed today in my office said they would buy this product. 7 out of 10 men interviewed yesterday in my office said they would buy this product. Therefore, 75% of men on the street outside my office would say they would buy this product if they were interviewed in the same manner on any given day. This predictive inductive argument uses statistical data as evidence, although the sampling method and the statistical technique are extremely primitive. It is also a form of enumerative induction because the probability provided in the conclusion gets closer and closer to the real value as the sample size approaches the population size. This particular argument is evidently weak and uncogent because the sample size of 20 collected very informally over 2 days is not exactly reliable. To make it stronger, you should increase the sample size and make sure that the sample is representative and randomized, and that appropriate statistical analyses are performed on the collected data. 10. Person A likes anime, studies Japanese, and likes ramen. Person B likes anime and studies Japanese. Therefore, person B must also like ramen. The first premise states that person A has 3 characteristics. The second premise states that person B shares 2 out of the 3 characteristics with person A. Since person A and person B are similar in these 2 respects, the conclusion infers that person B must also be similar to person A with respect to the third characteristic. This form of inductive reasoning is referred to as argument from analogy. The strength of this argument depends on the strength of the correlation between the 2 shared characteristics and the third predicted characteristic. However, unless the argument includes an extra premise that shows the expected correlation, it is considered a weak argument. Conversely, if you can show a strong correlation, the argument becomes stronger. As you saw in these examples, the strength of an inductive argument must be evaluated on the basis of the factuality, relevance, quality, and quantity of the evidence you provide in the premises, as well as the degree of coherence with established facts. Firstly, always make sure to ask yourself whether each piece of evidence you provide is factual. A single untrue premise renders the whole argument uncogent. Secondly, ask yourself whether each piece of evidence can be omitted without affecting the overall strength of the argument. Thirdly, ask yourself whether the data could have been obtained, analyzed, and presented in better ways. Next, ask yourself whether the quantity of the evidence is sufficient. Finally, ask yourself whether each piece of evidence coheres with or contradicts what you already know and what you expect. Paradigm-shifting discoveries are scarce. Always make sure your evidence makes sense. This is the end of this episode. Don't forget to have a go at the exercise questions, and please let me know if you have any questions or requests. See you soon.